Good morning, everyone. I hope everybody's having a great week and a good weekend, and I hope your business is doing really, really well. Well, today I'm going to be covering the residential purchase agreement, and not from the point of view of going line by line and telling you how to fill out a line. Most of you will know that. If by chance you do want one of your brokers, either myself here in San Diego, or Jeff Green up in Northern California, or Omar in LA, Orange County Marketplace, or Mary Jane in the Temecula Murrieta Marketplace, please contact them direct. We're all more than willing and happy to sit down with you and go through the RPA in a detailed explanation as to how to complete the RPA line by line, page by page. So please keep that in mind. The point I'm going to be talking about today is I'm just going to be covering some of the hot spots of the RPA and things I've noticed in my file review and some of the items I just want to emphasize to you as to what you should be aware of, how it may affect your transaction in terms of the smoothness and going through it. And I hope that you'll find it beneficial. Like always, if you have any questions, you can email me at sandiegobroker.com or sandiegobroker@ajicorporate.com, or you can give me a call. You all have my phone number, so feel free to do that at any time. I always respond. First, I'm going to talk about the agency. It's a hot button with me, and it's because I'm going through a procuring cause scenario with one of our agents right now. And the agency agreement, as I've stated before, is not going to make or break a situation like a procuring cause. But what it does do is it establishes a relationship between the client and the agent. And so it is vitally important that you get that relationship established as soon as possible within your contact with the client. Like I said, it's not going to be a guarantee you're going to win any procuring cause case that may come up. It doesn't mean that client is obligated to stay with you to buy a home. But what it does is it establishes the relationship. And it's an easy form to talk about. It's an easy form to get signed by the client, because all you're doing is talking about what your obligation is in terms of your fiduciary responsibility towards that client should they decide to work with you and purchase a home or list a home with you. So again, get this signed as early in the process as you can. It won't do any harm, and it has benefits to it, so please keep that in mind. The residential purchase agreement. Some of the items that I have seen, as I mentioned in my file review, that I think would be helpful if you keep in mind as you're completing this with your client to submit for the seller's review and hopefully approval. On the close of escrow, it's item 1D. I notice a lot of people put days in there: 45-day escrow, 30-day escrow, 60-day escrow. My recommendation, and that's fine, but my recommendation is put a date in there. Put an actual date that's 30, 45, 60 days, whatever the timetable is you're putting in, put a date on there, and obviously have a calendar with you so that when you put that date, you completely understand, and the buyer completely understands that the closing date is not on a Saturday, Sunday, or a holiday. It's going to be on whatever day is decided within that 45 days. But make sure, or 30 days, whatever is agreed upon or whatever they wish you to put down. But make sure when you put down a date, that gives everybody a target date. By putting down days, time and time again, I find that those days end up on a Saturday, Sunday, or Monday, and then everybody's back at the negotiating table to figure out what is going to be the exact date. It can't be on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday, so is it going to be before, or is it going to be after? So again, just save yourself some aggravation and time by addressing that issue at the time you write the offer. Make sure the closing date is not going to be on any of those days I mentioned. The other thing I think is vitally important, and I know we as agents get emotionally wrapped up in our transactions with our clients. And so if an issue comes up that starts turning the transaction into a sideways motion, I have found that in not going to say many cases, but in a number of cases, the agent gets as emotional about the situation as the client, and as a result, the situation becomes exaggerated to the point where it's a problem, where it need not be a problem. So again, I want to point out on item 1E of the RPA, it clearly states, buyer and seller are referred to herein as parties. Brokers are not parties to this agreement. So keep that in mind. You're there to help your client, whether it's the buyer or the seller, but you are not a part of the agreement. Only the buyer and seller are a part of the agreement. So make sure that you understand that and keep that in your mind so that as situations may come up, you're going to be in the right frame of mind to try to keep the emotional level, particularly on your side, but even so on your client's side, down to a minimum so you can work through the situation and come to a peaceful resolution. This will really help you down the road in terms of getting referral business from that client. If they see you're clear-headed and calm in a situation they didn't quite understand and we're getting more emotional, and they will credit you for being level-headed, knowledgeable, and a true professional. So again, you're not a party to the transaction. Only the buyer and seller are a part of that transaction. The other thing I want to talk about here is when you get to item 3, financing, regarding the financing portion of the RPA. First of all, the initial deposit and or any added deposit, that line that's on the contract. Have your buyer wire the money in. You as agents, we do not want you to take personal checks, even if they're made out to an escrow company, into your personal possession. The reason is, once you take a check, even if it's made out to an escrow company, has to have a trust log. So if you accept a deposit check, an escrow deposit check, you will need to make sure that you log it into a trust log and log it out of a trust log. When you take it to escrow or when you take it to the title company, wherever you end up taking or handing it back to the owner, to the client, you have to make sure that you have a trust log. It's a legal issue. It's a big issue with the BRE, and we as a brokerage do not want you to take personal checks. Give all the information and the wiring to your client so they can go directly to their bank and wire it directly into the escrow company. It's a clean, easy process. It saves you time and it keeps you out of trouble, potential trouble, when it comes to trust log and handling client funds. Stay away from it. It's not worth it. Keep in mind that once the seller agrees to the offer being presented by a buyer, that's the deal. So if the buyer is saying, I'm going to be doing this loan and with this lender, in order for them to change their mind later because they believe they're going to get a lower rate, they have to get permission from the seller to do that. They cannot make a unilateral decision on, I'm changing the lender because I think I can get a better rate or I can get a better rate somewhere else. Once the deal's agreed to, once the transaction's agreed to and the RPA is signed off, that is the deal. So in order for a buyer to change that portion of it, they have to go to the seller, make a request to change lenders, and do so, and get it in writing if the seller accepts, and have it signed off by the seller and have it signed off by the buyer, and then move forward. You cannot make a unilateral decision on that. So make sure when you're talking to your buyer in writing up the RPA, you make it clear that this is the deal. And in order to change any part of this transaction, as we're writing it down now, it has to be agreed upon by both you, the buyer, and the seller. You cannot make a unilateral decision on it. Loan applications, you know, it has to be in within 3 days. The appraisal has to be completed in 17 days, or as written or modified in the RPA at the time you submit it and the seller accepts it. Loan approval, 21 days. Go through the RPA. As you're going through this, make notations of these dates. And the purpose and the point of that is know your dates. Know in this transaction that I'm coming up on an appraisal contingency release date. We're coming up on the 17th day. So you need to keep in continual communication with your buyer and with the buyer's lender. You need to have your buyer give the lender permission to talk to you, because some lenders will not, because their fiduciary responsibilities to the buyer and the buyer alone. You're not asking for detailed information necessarily, but you need to know what is the progress. How is this processing? Are there issues? Are these issues being resolved, if there are any? So again, make sure that you know these contingency dates, because as the contingency date comes up, I know when I was in production, I was a stickler for that. I let the selling agent know we're coming up on an appraisal release date, contingency release date. You need to keep in mind that I need that, and I'm going to press for that contingency to be released on time. If I get to the day before and I'm not hearing the answers I wanted to hear, I would automatically issue with my seller a notice to perform. Again, you just want to keep on top of it. If you're on the selling side, you want to stay on top of it for your seller, so it looks like you're doing what you need to do, and that you are a true professional, and you're not just signing RPAs and and hoping they close. You need to stay on top of it and let the buyer's agent. It's important there too to let them know that hey, this is the way I am, and this is what I'm going to be doing. And as long as everybody complies, then we're going to have a great transaction here. But if you start swaying from what is agreed upon, I'm going to be there to call you on it. So again, really that enhances your position, not only with your seller. Your seller's going to love it, but also with the other agent and the community, the real estate community at large, because agents know, and as we all know, the word gets around within our community, that in my case, Tom stays on top of this. He's professional. He doesn't become aggressive, and he doesn't become condescending or mean about this. He's just very professional. This is the agreement. We all need to hold to it. So again, keep that in mind and stay on top of it, because that is an important issue. Again, buyer stated finance. If once the buyer states that and the seller agrees to it, that is the deal. So if a buyer is going to change lenders due to lower interest rates, whatever their reason, then you need to get it in writing by way of an addendum and have it signed off by the seller that they agree to the change. Now, the biggest problem there obviously is going to be timing. Depending on when this change request would come about, we could be 10 days into a transaction or 12 days into a transaction. And is that going to leave on day 17 or day 21 enough time for the lender to get the approval needed so they can release that contingency on time? So again, you got to keep that in mind. And as a buyer's agent, you need to emphasize that, because you don't want, once you sign everything and once you provide the proof of loan approval to the seller to show that, number one, the buyer has the necessary funds, but number two, they're also a qualified buyer. As a seller's agent, I would be very reluctant to recommend they allow a client to change. If there's an issue with the loan, or if this lender is turning out not to be good, then I understand there's exceptions to the rule, but you have to stay on top of that to make sure it's not just a whimsical change that a buyer wants to make. Because I've seen those too, and those can turn out to be a real headache for both the buyer's agent, and the seller's agent, so as well as the seller. So keep that in mind. Once the deal is signed and once it's agreed upon, if any changes take place, it has to be changes that are agreed upon either by way of an amendment or an addendum, depending on the type of change. Allocation of cost. When you're talking about inspections, when you're talking about reports or certificates that are required, it's negotiable. And you can check the appropriate box as you're completing the RPA with regards to what is appropriate and for the buyer to pay and what the seller wants to pay. And when I say appropriate, I mean really what it comes down to, if you're representing the buyer, it's the buyer's wishes. and you can put down that the seller's to pay for everything. And the seller can come back and counter out things they don't want to pay for. So those are type of things you need to have discussions about. So for example, if your buyer says, I want the seller to pay for my home inspection report, again, you explain to the buyer that this is normally a buyer's cost, not a seller's cost, but we can put it in and the seller can take it out. And more than likely that is what will happen. So don't be upset, don't be bothered by the fact that the seller is not going to continue on and pay your home inspection report. Likewise, if I had this question just the other day, government requirements and retrofit. The question was, the seller pays for this, right? And the answer is, it's negotiable. Again, when you look on the contract on page, what page is this, 3, it clearly states, it has a box that you can check for buyer, has a box you can check for seller, and it talks about the retrofit and compliance issues with regards to smoke alarms and those type of things, carbon monoxide, those type of things. So keep in mind, everything is negotiable. So there's no, yes, the pattern of this is the way we normally work things, it doesn't apply. It's all negotiable. So if you have a seller who is, looking at this saying, well, do I have to pay for the retrofitting? No, the answer is no. It's negotiable. So if you get an offer where they're asking the seller to cover it, you can negotiate it out through your counter offer. So keep that in mind. Lease or lien items and systems. That's a biggie. That's a real big headache. That can cause a buyer not to qualify. A buyer can, with his solar contracts that are out there that turn out to be liens on the property, with the contingency that the solar company has the ability to approve a buyer or not approve a buyer, even though the buyer has loan approval from their lender. I've seen cases where the solar company refused to accept the lender's approval and would not approve the buyer for whatever the reason might be. Likewise, HOA. I found this in the last couple of transactions I've had to deal with our agents. Some of these manufactured home communities have a clause in the HOA that the HOA has the ability to pre-qualify the buyer. So again, a buyer can go through full completion on all the terms and conditions of their loan, get formal loan approval, only to find out that that buyer has been turned down by the HOA and can't move forward with the transaction. So, again, you want to make sure you're on top of those things to find out exactly what are going to be the requirements for an example would be like a solar lease, an HOA approval process. Does the HOA have the ability to nix a sale? Some do, some don't. So you just have to be kind of cognizant of that and keep that in mind when you're filling it out. And again, this is just something you want to tell your buyer about so it's not a surprise to them. It doesn't pop up. Again, it makes you look like you're on top of your game. You know what you're talking about. And it doesn't need to go into big detail about it. It's just a matter of, hey, listen, there are some HOAs out there that require their approval before the transaction can continue. So it's not just a matter of getting loan approval. The HOA could be an issue here as well. Check with the selling agent to see if they have any information regarding that process. Solar, in the contract it states that the seller's obligated within 3 days to provide all contracts that may affect the ability of the buyer to purchase or a cloud on the title with regards to obligations. So you want to get all that information. And once a buyer receives that information, they have a 3-day review and approval process. So you want to get that in right away, because you don't want to get 2 weeks down the line, have everything come in. I've seen them come in as late as 3 weeks down the line with the HOA and with some of these contracts, and the deal goes dead after 2 or 3 weeks because the buyers didn't like the wording, they don't like the obligation, they don't like the cloud on the title, or the HOA comes in and says, no, this buyer's not qualified, we don't accept it to our qualification standards, you got an issue, you got a problem. Now you've got an issue where you got a cancellation on your hands and you're starting all over from square one, and your buyer is not happy. They want to know why this would come about the way it happened, and not move forward with that. Excuse me one second, I did have a text here. Okay, it's another issue. So keep that in mind. And for lender, yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you.
You said it on your live feed.
What's that?
That was one of the questions on your live feed.
Oh, was it? You're going to hand that to me so I can just see it again. I'm sorry. I had a question come in on a live feed, so I want to answer it while I'm at this point. A change in lender or lender needs to be approved by seller. If the client is staying with the same lender, no. I mean, that's within the loan processing process with the lender that's been identified up front and the loan is going through. So if a buyer gets notice from their lender that they need additional clarification on certain items with their credit, with their financing, with their income, whatever the case might be, then no. I mean, it's up to the buyer and the lender to deal with that to make sure it gets taken care of. If it's an issue where it could be a problem for title, an IRS lien that's excessive that the buyer can't pay off, yeah, then those are things that will pop up, and any lender won't approve of a buyer with a high IRS lien. So that's going to pop up on the buyer side, particularly when title runs the buyer side title information. So you need to be cognizant, and it's really within the processing. So if a buyer goes from, say, an adjustable rate loan processing, that's what they have identified. Now they're going to go to a fixed rate with the same lender. Then that lender has all the information. They have all of the buyer's information regarding all the important factors to get loan approval. The seller has a right to say, are you qualified for the fixed rate loan on this? And the lender is going to have to come in and answer that question for the seller to satisfy all concerned. But in terms of staying with the same lender and changing a program within the lender, that first of all needs to be addressed with the lender to say, yeah, this buyer qualifies to go from an adjustable rate loan, which is a lower starting interest rate, to a fixed rate, which is a bit higher, and they are qualified. Then the buyer and the buyer's agent should provide a new qualification statement to the seller that indicates, hey, we're going to go from adjustable rate to a fixed rate, and here's our qual letter. It's not affecting the timing of our escrow. If it's anything, if they're making the last minute change and it's going to affect timing on the contingency release and obviously potentially the escrow close, then yeah, the seller has to approve on that. Hope that clarifies. If not, just reach out to me later and I'll be happy to discuss it in more detail. Again, I left off at the government retrofits. Make sure it's a negotiable item. It's not always a seller having to pay for it. It's whatever's negotiated when the deal is settled. Same way with the lease and lien items. With systems, solar panels are probably the biggest culprit. I had a call the other day at my home from a telemarketer, wanting to talk to me about solar. I said, no, I'm not interested, thank you. And the main reason for that is I don't like that, that two reasons why I'm not big on solar. And it's not because of the energy efficiency. We're all in favor of that. But when it comes to your home and the ability for you to market or sell your home at a later date, should you decide to do that, two things come into play. One, if you lease the equipment, then you've got the lease agreement and you have their approval process to go through. And it's another item the buyer has to take into consideration before they can purchase your home. That's number one. Number two, technology today, particularly in the solar field, is so changing. You buy a brand new system today, even if you're paying cash for it, in 3 years from today, it's outdated. I mean, the technology is changing so rapidly. For you to take a big hit today, $30,000, $40,000, whatever the size of your home is, it's not cheap. and then you say, I'm going to get a lot of benefit out of this. You know, in 3 years from today, whatever system you put in today is going to be outdated. You know, you're going to have new technology. You're going to have better technology. So, you know, again, I'm not a big proponent of, you know, my clients or my friends come to me and say, hey, Tom, what do you think? I usually advise them not to do it for that reason I just gave. I've had friends of mine who have done it, who have come to me and said, God, I wish I would have called you first, because, you know, it just is a real pain, particularly now that I'm trying to sell my home. So, you know, again, keep that in mind. Another thing that, inspections, you know, a real potential problem with homeowners, you know, home inspections and that is what, you know, when these outside contractors who are licensed come into your home and to do their work, what happens if they get hurt? Who's responsible for that? You know, who's going to be liable for that, which is the big question. So you need to ensure as a selling agent and for your seller that whoever comes into the home at the buyer's request is licensed, is insured, and you know, one form you can actually use that will protect the owner is the notice of non-responsibility. It's a CAR form. It's NNR, and you can have everybody sign off on it. It's a CAR form document, so it does live beyond the transaction. So should a home inspector come in and break his leg, falling off a ladder, whatever it might happen, and he decides to sue at a later date after the close of escrow and coming back on you, this form is still legal and it's still good, and it will last beyond the actual transaction RPA. So keep that in mind. It's a good document to have. It's a protection for the seller, and it's one I would recommend, you know, with today, particularly in California being such a litigious state. Buyer has 17 days to complete all their inspections unless otherwise negotiated down. Keep that in mind. Put that on your list of, you know, make sure everything is being handled in a proper timetable so you can release that contingency as soon as it's completed. The rest of this item, you know, seller's right to cancel. This happens a lot. I mean, I'm sure most of you have experienced this, where your buyer has decided to cancel within the contract agreement for an item they might have, or a situation they're not happy with that they became aware of through the inspection process. And so they submit a notice, a cancellation notice to the seller for sign, and the seller declines or delays, which just happens. Everybody gets emotional and then they refuse to sign. It states on page 6 of the contract, right at the very bottom, a party may be subject to, and this is buyer or seller, could be subject to civil penalty up to $1,000 for refusing to sign cancellation instructions if no good faith dispute exists as to who is entitled to the deposited funds. So keep that in mind. You know, that if you have a seller or a buyer, you know, both happens, that refuses to sign the cancellation document, the other party has the ability to recoup the funds as well as an added $1,000 due to damages because of that unreasonable refusal. So, you know, again, keep all of this in mind when you're completing the document, and some of this information, you know, again, the buyer should be made aware of it so that they understand that, you know, it's important to stay within the confines of this agreement, because once you go outside it, once you've gone beyond the 17 days for a home inspection contingency, technically that buyer is non-compliant and can lose their deposit. So you need to, you know, depending on the legal status and how a seller decides to proceed. So keep your clients, both buyer and seller, compliant. An interesting paragraph in the RPA is on page 7, and it's about midway down. It's 18B, and it's a scope of duty by the real estate agent towards their client, buyer or seller. And if you read that paragraph in detail, it states, you know, what a real estate agent is responsible for, and it talks about and not responsible for. So your client may, if they read the contract, which they should, may cut that part and say, hey, Tom, what are your duties? I read this a paragraph, and it doesn't sound like you're responsible for much. So read that. If you're not familiar with it, read that paragraph. And the agents in my area, if you have any questions on it or how to handle a question of that nature, call me. I'd like to brainstorm with each of you on that, so that we can get a clear idea and understanding as to how you should approach this. That should be a part of your listing presentation or your buyer presentation, explaining exactly what your duties are in terms of your fiduciary responsibilities. And keeping in mind and presenting to them, you're not a legal tax expert. You're not an attorney. So when it comes to those type of situations where advice is needed, we as real estate agents are not the people to come to. We're going to refer you to your tax accountant. We're going to refer you to a real estate attorney so that you'll know how to proceed with the proper information. We're not up to date on that information, and we shouldn't be. We don't want to be experts in everything. So again, that's why they have their tax man. That's why they have their attorneys. Arbitration, mediation, when a dispute does arise and you have to go that route, it's not cheap, it's not free, it's expensive, and your client needs to know that. And I had a situation this week actually where an agent called me and she submitted a cancellation for the escrow she and her client were in, and it had been 5 days and the seller hadn't responded. Well, we're dealing with it with the other agent and the other agent's broker right now. I'm in the middle of that. But keep in mind one thing, and our buyer's saying, well, I'm going to take this to mediation arbitration. Well, it's expensive, and I took a look at their deposit amount, and I'm saying, they're going to spend it all on this issue. Let us just handle it. And if it's beyond the arbitration mediation process, or if a client decides to take it beyond that process, you get into attorneys and you get into court costs, it's going to be far more than that. So, again, keep in mind, mediation arbitration is a good process. It certainly will allow both sides to present their case in a neutral manner and get a decision. If you get a client that buyer or seller who insists on getting an attorney and suing, that's fine. Again, it's not our position to recommend mediation arbitration or go get an attorney, but we should refer them to an attorney so they can get the legal advice there and let the attorney tell them, no, don't do it, or yes, go ahead and do it. So again, keep that in mind. I'm just in closing here. Every one of us on page 10, as we present the offer to our seller. Now, we have the offer, we presented it to the seller. If you go to page 10 at the bottom, it says presentation of offer, and then a line for initials. You as the agent presenting that offer need to initial that along with and date it. If there's a complete rejection right off the top from the seller, you need to get that right underneath that is rejection of offer. Get the seller's initial on that rejection of offer and have them date it. That will save you a bunch of headaches when it comes to later, if it's a multiple offer situation, which we're seeing now. Agents challenging you, all you have to do is make a copy of the last page that shows the seller's initials on the rejection of offer. So again, on every offer, accepted or not, you should be initialing as a listing agent that you presented the offer. If it's rejected, make sure that seller has signed the rejected offer. If there's a counter offer, obviously you don't need that rejection because you countered the offer. But keep that in mind. And the last thing is at the very bottom, you'll see buyer's initials. Get your buyer to initial that last page. I can't tell you how many files I have to, purchase agreement files I have to reject because that's not initialed. I have to send it back to the agent to get their client to sign it. So please keep that in mind as you're completing the transaction signature part of the RPA. So again, thank you for your time today. I hope you found this useful and beneficial. If you have any questions on this, contact your broker and we will be happy to assist and answer any questions you might have. Have a great rest of the week.